allow something like this to happen. You might even be wondering why we have to go through trials at all. Well, even with these questions lingering in our minds, we can take comfort in the fact that God himself went through isolation, fear, and darkness. Through Jesus Christ, God went through what we fear most, the greatest darkness, death. Jesus experienced the same stresses we do. In fact, he prayed in the garden on the night he was betrayed that if it could be done any other way, then he prayed that it would be done a different way. Nevertheless, he concluded, not my will, but yours be done.
As Christ finished praying, he gathered with 11 of the disciples. The 12, Judas, had left earlier in the night to gather soldiers and religious leaders in order to have him arrested. In John 13, Jesus had already predicted that Judas would betray him. And in Luke 22, Judas walks up to Jesus with a mob standing all around, and he kisses Jesus. Jesus says, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" John 18 says they arrested Jesus, tied him up, and took him away. The abandonment begins right here with the betrayal of Judas. Jesus knew his disciples would abandon him in his darkest hour. In John 16:32, he tells them, "An hour is coming and has come, and you will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me." And this is exactly what happens. Mark 14:50 tells us that after Christ was arrested, they all deserted him and ran away. So Jesus is taken to face his accusers. He faces them alone. But Peter is lurking nearby. He can't stand with Jesus, but he can't desert him either. Peter followed behind the mob and ended up outside of the place they had taken Jesus. Now Peter starts out pretty strong in John 18. Once the group arrives to arrest Jesus, Peter steps up in verse 10. It says, "Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear." And then in verse 15, we see Peter follow Jesus with another disciple. And these two are let into the high priest's courtyard because the unnamed disciple gets them in. But in verse 17, the slave girl who lets them into the courtyard says, "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" And Peter says, "I am not." Peter is warming himself by a fire with many others because it was cold. And those standing around in verse 25 say, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" Again, Peter says, "I am not." But in verse 26, another slave of the high priest pushes Peter by saying, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter denied it. The third time Peter says, "I don't know this man." Luke 22:61 says, "The Lord turned and looked at Peter." Peter was not off somewhere far away. He could see Jesus, and he still denied him. John 19:1 said Pilate had Jesus flogged. This is a brutal lashing on the bare back of the person receiving the beating. Metal and bone are attached to the ends of a whip. They dig into the back and peel away strips of flesh. The beatings were so brutal that some people never made it to crucifixion. They died from the trauma of the beating. John 19:2 says, the soldiers also twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and threw a purple robe around him, and said, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were slapping him in the face. In verses 5-6, Pilate brings Jesus out and says, "Here is the man." The crowd calls out, "Crucify!" Pilate hesitates. It's clear he does not have the stomach to crucify Jesus. He doesn't want to do it. He tells them in verse 6, "Look, if you want to kill him, go do it yourselves." But the religious leaders push him. Jesus must die. In verse 7, they make it clear that because Jesus claims to be the Son of God, he must die. Their law demands it. In verse 8, after Pilate heard the religious leaders say Jesus had claimed to be the Son of God, he was more afraid than ever. Pilate takes Jesus back in and questions him again. In verse 9, Pilate asks, "Where are you from?" Jesus doesn't answer. In verse 10, Pilate says, "You're not talking to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" In verse 11, Jesus responds, "You would have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given you from above." So in verse 12, we read Pilate makes an effort to release him. And this is amazing. A politician who, of course, is going to ultimately reject Jesus for political gain is actually working to release Jesus. Not because he cares about some greater justice, but because of who Jesus is. But the religious leaders won't tolerate it. In verse 12, they say, "You're no friend of Caesar if you let him go. This guy claims to be a king." Again, he presents Jesus to the religious leaders. Pilate says, "Here is your king." The religious leaders say, "We have no king but Caesar." Finally, in John 19:16, we read, "Because of them, he handed over to be crucified." Pilate gives in.
John 19:17-18 says, carrying his own cross, he went out to what is called Skull Place. There they crucified him. Matthew 27 says, darkness came over the land. And in that afternoon, as he was close to death, Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The final abandonment had taken place as Christ took the sins of the world on himself, on his broken body. And in the final moments, the unthinkable happened as fellowship with God the Father broke for a brief moment, and he took on all the sin and all of our punishment. Then Matthew 27:50 says, Jesus shouted again with a loud voice and gave up his spirit.